This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So Manuel, who is submitting his thesis at King's College in a couple of months' time, he's going to be talking to us about sport in the Soviet Union, from the Soviet Union to the present day.
Well, it's actually just football. In a sense, what I'm presenting today is my PhD dissertation, which is very much done at this moment. It's just really last revisions. It's called Selling the People's Game, Football's Transition from Communism to Capitalism, Soviet Union Successor States. And the period of research is 1987 to 2014. Why those dates? Because 1987 is when Perestroika and Glasnost kicked off. Why 2014? Well, I had to end it somewhere, but I really felt when the Maidan demonstration broke out in Ukraine and the 2014 World Cup in Brazil, sort of that 4 years before Russia 2018, was a very nice point to just say, okay, this is where I'm going to stop. These are the main chapters or sections of the thesis. So it's leagues and federations, how the league and federation transited from the 1987 to 1991, and then how it went on from there, sort of the breakup of the Soviet Union, what happened to the different leagues and federations. I'm going to only use a few case examples, because if I would mention every single one of them, we'd be sitting here all night. Club ownership, stadium ownership, the two tie in a little bit. Player contracts, advertisement and sponsorship. These, again, the last section will tie in a little bit with club ownership, and you will see why in a few moments. So this is the first section, the splitting the spoils, as I call this section, because it's really about how the league was split up. And I really want to start talking about the Soviet Vysshaya Liga, or Soviet Supreme League or Soviet Top League. It really depends how you translate it. And the Soviet Vysshaya Liga was a really interesting league because it was a league of many nations. You have to sort of imagine the United Kingdom playing a league, you know, with Welsh teams, although we have Welsh teams, but technically Wales has its own championship, Scottish teams, Northern Irish teams, etc. They actually did this, and they did the first two divisions. They were completely merged into one single structure. So what you had, in a sense, you had the best Russian clubs competing with the best Ukrainian clubs, with the best teams from Armenia, from and so on and so on. And it made it a really fascinating competition, because I like to draw a parallel that the Soviet Union wasn't actually not really just a league. It was a Champions League of many nations that took part of the Soviet Union. It was a really good representation of what the Soviet Union was like, because it was a very diverse league with clubs playing from very many different countries. After 1987, the Soviet Vysshaya Liga enters a period of reform, and this goes hand in hand with Perestroika and Glasnost. And Perestroika, reconstructioning, is really the key term here, because what they want to do, and this is, when I read this, I thought this was fascinating. They wanted to create a union of football clubs that were playing independently from Goskomsport and the Football Federation in their own managed league, sort of what the Premier League did. I think it was in 1992 when the Premier League was established. They wanted to manage the league themselves. They did this 5 years before the Premier League even thought about doing this, and this was really just because there was this idea of bringing in reform, bringing in new structures in football, but also that the leagues were supposed to generate money rather than receiving money from the state. But it ended up being a really interesting debate, because you had clubs on the one hand, and the two characters that I like to focus on here for a second is, on the one hand, is Lobanovsky, who is a very strong character. He was the manager of Dynamo Kiev for a very long time, and he really wanted the league to go independent. And on the other hand, you have Goskomsport with Vyacheslav Koloskov, and Vyacheslav Koloskov is still in power today in Russia when it comes to Russian football, and he wanted the league to go independent, but the Soviet Football Federation still to run it. So you had a real power struggle, and that power struggle really lasted until the Soviet Union collapsed. But when you go sort of through the statements and interviews, it was probably the most public kind of restructuring process that you find in the period in the Soviet Union, because this debate was in the open, in interviews, in newspapers. They would literally call each other idiots, etc. It's really interesting to watch, because you wouldn't find that in any other reform processes that went on in the Soviet Union at the time. How did the league end? What was interesting, it ended when Georgia declared its independence in 1990. And they were actually not recognized as an independent state until the Soviet Union collapsed, but they were recognized as an independent football body already in 1990. Which actually means that the first independent institution in the Soviet space was actually football. And they did this, they broke off, they created their own league, then they renamed all their teams into national entities. Dinamo Tbilisi for 1 or 2 years became Iberia Tbilisi. Iberia is the old traditional name for Georgia. So that sort of started the whole process. Lithuania would then declare independence and all the other countries would follow and the league would split up. There was actually a time where they tried to preserve the league even though all these states were independent, but UEFA and FIFA really quickly shut this down because they didn't want to have a multinational league, even though there was a multinational league before, but they didn't want to have it because all the states were independent. So what they then tried to do is bring in the Commonwealth of Independent States Cup, the CIS Cup. And the CIS Cup was a Champions League of the post-Soviet space. It didn't last very long because of Champions League. Champions League brought in huge amount of money, and Russian and Ukrainian clubs, which really is the only two leagues that matter in the post-Soviet space today, they only went for Champions League because that's where they could make lots of money. That brings me to the Russian Premier League, and the Russian Premier League is interesting because they actually went through with this whole professionalization process and they actually have a very good league structure. They're suffering a little bit because they're complete, and we'll talk more about this in the ownership section, but they're suffering a little bit because although they have the money, they don't generate the money themselves. The money comes in from the owners. So that's a huge problem for them, which is why they have for a long time now proposed to create this new league, the Unified League. And the Unified League is sort of to bring back the old Soviet league. And was supposed to bring in Ukraine and Russia in one league and then slowly but surely other leagues. But although the owners of both Ukraine and Russian clubs want this, it's currently impossible because of Maidan. Okay, this is the league structure. As I said, Soviet Supreme League on the top. Then you had the first division. These are between 16 and 18 teams in the first, 20 to 24. And these two leagues were multinational. And then you go down and they split it up in zones. And then on the fourth level, it was a Republican level. So Armenia would run its own championship. Ukraine would run its own championship. And these leagues would then become actually the basis for the new independent leagues. Okay, ownership. Again, key date, 1987. Why? Perestroika and Glasnost, and it was really expected from clubs to become independent and run themselves financially because the state was out of money. Before that, clubs were completely sponsored by states. They were owned by ministries, they were owned by factories, they were owned by different institution unions, etc. And on top of that, they had a patron. Give you an example, Dynamo Kiev was owned by the Ministry of Interior of Ukraine, but they had a patron with the first secretary of Ukraine, Shebitsky, who was the de facto ruler of the Ukrainian Republic, and he made sure that Dynamo Kiev would have all the resources that the club needs. So if they wanted to get a player, they wouldn't buy him, but they would give him a car, they would give him an apartment, they would make sure that he gets the holiday resorts go down to the holiday resorts. You know, all the things that you could get in the Soviet Union, that you could get in a place where the money didn't really matter that much. So this ends after 1987. It doesn't end rapidly for all the clubs at the same time, but it slowly starts to end. And the first case is Dnipropetrovsk. Dnipropetrovsk goes independent, and they are sort of used as a test case. They use this club because they're not attached to a big ministry, they're not attached to an important industry as well. They're just a minor factory team. So it's really easy for the state to say, okay, we'll try this club. And it works really well because they can now run their own merchandise, they can now own their own ticket sales, and they are able to sign sponsorship deals. So they actually run a profit. Their first year they run 300,000 ruble profit. It doesn't sound like a lot in today's terms, but in Russia back then that was a lot of money. So all the other clubs start copying it. The only one club that is a bit reluctant is Spartak. And Spartak is reluctant because they sort of were running an independent club anyways already in the 1980s, because they had they were officially part of a union, but their patron was the city of Moscow government. And the city of Moscow government, every time Spartak wanted to bring in a player, the city of Moscow would give them an apartment. And if the player left, the Spartak would just hold on. And it's rumored that Spartak had somewhere in the region of 2,000 apartments all over the city of Moscow that they could just, parcel off and sell. And that's why they were very reluctant to use this new model, because they wanted to get the state subsidies on top of it. Regardless, they are the most dominant club in the 1990s. Why? Because when everyone goes independent after the Soviet Union collapses, they've already done it for many years. So they have land, so they're able to run the club for the first 10 years, basically own Russian football. And that really changes in 1998, because in 1998 the Russian economy collapses, but recovers very quickly, and this economic collapse brings in Putin, and with Putin comes the change in Russian society and in Russian economics. Big players come in, oil and gas. And oil and gas means big companies like Gazprom, state-owned companies, would start buying football clubs. And that changes the dynamic of Russian football, because all of a sudden other clubs have a lot more money than Spartak, and that changes quite a lot. In Ukraine, you have a very interesting scenario and this happens really right away after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that different oligarchs would take over clubs, and they would use clubs in connection with big media companies to gain a big political profile. I call this process Berlusconization, because it's similar to what Berlusconi did in Italy. And it's really fascinating, because today you can see different clubs are owned by different political groups in Ukraine, and they're oligarchs. And I always find that you can just tell who's aligned with whom in Ukraine, because you can see who owns whom. And there's actually a really interesting case example. When I was living in Ukraine in 2012, there's 2 TV stations that had signed the rights to show the Ukrainian Premier League. One of the stations was owned by Akhmetov and Shakhtar Donetsk, and the other station was owned by Kolomoisky, Dnipro, and Dnipropetrovsk. So all the teams that were associated with Kolomoisky, they all showed their home games on Kolomoisky's TV station. And all the people that were associated with Shakhtar Donetsk and Akhmetov, they all showed their team's home games on Football Adin, his station. And when a club would leave and change to the other side, that was almost like, crossing the floor in Parliament, which is really fascinating. So I thought that was a really interesting process to watch this when I was there. Okay, next, the people's theaters. So stadiums. Stadiums, they did the same process than clubs. They were made independent in 1987 because they were expected to run a profit. The state just didn't have the money anymore to pay for the upkeep, so they were expected to run a profit. And I've seen archive material in the Russian State Archive where you can see this, where they sign sponsorship agreements and to bring in hard currency, and they try to sign on friendly games just to bring in money to generate currency. But also these stadiums after 1987 become platforms for political unrest. 2 examples that I want to point out is the Khatstan in Armenia, which is the national stadium, which is located right underneath the genocide memorial. And that stadium is a huge stadium, was always filled, and when the Russian teams came to town, it was always a very kind of carnivalesque atmosphere and sort of a display that they wanted to get certain issues. And at first these issues weren't necessarily independence, but to just get more powers from Moscow. And as the time passes on, these stadiums really became even more than that. Then as soon as the Soviet Union collapses, and I mean, I've seen this at the Ratsdan. The stadium looks great here, but when you go in the interior, it really is in poor state. It's because the state doesn't care anymore for these stadiums. They're just not important. They were a national symbol when they were not nations, independent nations, but as soon as they got that, the state themselves didn't pay for it anymore. And today, the stadium was just renovated for 5 million euros. I think they should have spent maybe 10 times the sum to just get it all fixed up. Next, you see that in Russia too, and it's really interesting. There's this case in 1992. Moscow has no really good football facilities. Even today, they're struggling with this. And in 1992, the state of the stadium was so poor that CSKA Moscow had to play all their home games in Germany because they just didn't have the stadiums. And they just qualified for Champions League, for the first round of Champions League. They beat Barcelona in the qualification stage. Unheard of. And then they had to play all the games away because the stadiums were in really rough shape. And even last season, Russian clubs struggled to find enough good facilities in Moscow to play their home games for Champions League and Europa League. They try to fix this all up with Russia 2018, and they're spending a lot of money on it. I have the example of the Zenit St. Petersburg Stadium, which is currently stands at a cost of 1.3 billion. To put this in relations, the Allianz Arena Munich is a similar stadium, and it costs 380 million euros. So this stadium is already twice the price. This is what I talk about with UFOs in the post-Soviet space. This is the Olympijski Stadium in Ukraine, and it sits, unfortunately you can't really see in this picture, but it sits right in the square, and all around you have this old Soviet architecture, and then you have this UFO that looked like it was just placed there. It's a beautiful facility, don't get me wrong, but it's just really, I find it really kind of almost out of place. Yes, the transfer system. So players were always associated to the ministry, the union, and the factory that owned the club. But it's really interesting because the players, unlike most workers, actually had a constitutional right to move around. They would do this by saying in the press, hey, I want to go from Torpedo to Dynamo, and I want to use my constitutional right to move clubs. Workers could not do this. Players could, because they were public figures. On the other hand, clubs could also play on this. Dynamo, which was associated Ministry of Interior, and CSKA, which was associated to the army, they could use their constitutional rights to just draft players. High-profile cases, Hidadulin from Spartak, he didn't want to go to CSKA, and CSKA said, okay, we'll draft you, and then for 2 years he had to play for CSKA. So it's really interesting how you see these cases in Sovietsky sport and players saying, yeah, I want to have my constitutional rights, and they got them, where workers really didn't have a chance to get that at all. This changes again 1987. I keep repeating myself because players now are seen as an asset that can be sold to the West. The big high-profile case that I want to focus on, I know we mentioned Mikhailenko earlier, is Savarov, who gets sold from Dynamo Kiev to Juventus Turin for $5 million. The thing is, Dynamo Kiev didn't get a huge chunk of the money. A lot of the money went to an agency that's called Sofintersport that handled all transactions between the West and the Soviet Union from 1987 to 1991, sorry. And they took a chunk, and then Goscom Sport, the Ministry of Sport, took a chunk of the money. And you see, when you look at the state archives and you see at the contracts, it happens over and over and over again. And that money was supposed to subsidize sport, but that's not where it ended up. I have a theory where it went, but unfortunately there's not much of a case to prove it. But compensation payments also get introduced within the Soviet Union. And you have the case of Salenko, Oleg Salenko. Some of you guys might remember him, 1994. Dynamo wanted him, and Zenit said no. Zenit said, you are going to take this player, and then you're going to sell him to the West after 1 or 2 years and make lots of money. So we want to get some money ourselves. This was unheard of at that time, because within the Soviet Union there was no transfer fee. So they said, we want 500,000 rubles for Salenko. In the end, they didn't get that. They got 37,000 rubles, which at the time was $55,000. Not a lot of money, but it was, it was a case. It's like the Bosman case in the West. It was something that really groundbreaking, because now clubs had to pay compensation payments. As I mentioned, late 1980s, early 1990s, everyone who was of any kind of monetary value as a player was right away sold off to the West. So you get this huge player transfer from Russian and Ukrainian clubs just going westwards. That all changes again after 1998. And especially in the early 2000s, Russian and Ukrainian clubs start buying. And I have a little stat for that. This is from 2002 to 2012, the big Russian clubs and the two big clubs in Ukraine. This is their transfer deficit that they accumulated in 10 years in that period, which is a huge shift because they would sell, and then all of a sudden they had the cash. Why did they have the cash? Because they had sponsors that were able to pay for it. And to look at the advertisement and sponsor, it's the same idea again. In 1987, the Soviet Union wanted to generate cash, so they brought in sponsors to pay for the sport. So clubs were, through Sofintersport, connected with big sponsoring companies from the West. And they would then give club a certain percentage of hard currency, and the government would take the rest. This kind of system, of course, changes with the fall of the Soviet Union. Then clubs signed their own contracts, but there wasn't much of a market in Russia and Ukraine at the time. So clubs got relatively little sponsorship money. Again, big date is 1998 and what happens afterwards, because all of a sudden it's not just foreign sponsors that can pay, it's Russian sponsors and Ukrainian sponsors. And in Ukraine case, the sponsors are usually also the oligarchs and their companies. So they would say, okay, well, I own this club, so I'm gonna put the slogan of my company on the jersey. At Shakhtar Donetsk, for example, it's SCM, which is System Capital Management. It's owned by Rinat Akhmetov. It's really just a way of legitimately put money into a team, not just by giving it to them, just legitimately doing it. But the other big thing that happens, and this I find really interesting, is that Russian companies and Azerbaijan, or in this case the Land of Fire, Azerbaijani companies, or companies in general from the post-Soviet space, are now able to pay big sponsoring contracts, not just to clubs in the West, but also to UEFA, to football federations. So the cash flow really just went the other way around. And what this really overall led to is this patronage system, that you have these owners, that you have clubs associated to, in the case of Zenit, for example, to Gazprom, the ministry, or the former Ministry of Energy, and it's now still a state-owned company. So you still have this patronage system, but on top of that, they're also sponsors. And in some ways, some clubs in the West are even now dependent on this. So it's really kind of shows how interlinked, from the fall of the Soviet Union to today, the entire process has become. This is a quick picture from the 1980s. It's the cup final, I believe, in 87. And you can see that there's already advertisement in the stadium. Okay, my conclusion. And this is, I guess, some talking points that we can generally speak about. What can we learn from transition of football from communism to capitalism in post-Soviet space? I think what I take away from it, that some things really changed. That Soviet Union was a closed market. Russia and Ukraine is not. They're very interconnected with European football. But on the other hand, you still have some of these old Soviet mechanisms, the idea of patronage, of the state giving money to sport, the sport being seen as a vehicle to sort of transport certain ideologies, as is the case with Gazprom and the Land of Fire campaign. And I find that is really fascinating, because you can really see that there's a line there to be drawn, and you have this period in the 90s where that's not the case, but since 2000 it's really come back. And I think that is something that I have really taken away from it. What is the role of football? It's a really big role, because the Russia, Ukraine especially, they realized that football is the biggest sport. In the time of the Soviet Union, football it was football and hockey, but really it has changed. It's really, football is the most important sport now in Russia. Why? Because it just draws such big attention. Good example is the Russia 2018 World Cup, the amount of media attention it gets in Russia in comparison to the hockey World Cup that's going to happen in 2016. No one talks about that. Everyone talks about Russia 2018. It's all about the football. With this in mind, what can we expect from Russia 2018? We'll see. Thank you very much.
Sevket. Oh, yeah, you're here. Good. And you were plenty early, so our next speaker is Dr. Sevket Akyildiz. Is that correct?
That's right.
And he's talking about selling the game. No, sorry, that was Manuel.
Yeah.
Sevket's talking about post-Soviet sports in Central Asian republics.
Yeah, that's correct, and I'm glad to be sat next to Manuel because he's so full of energy.
Yeah.
So hopefully
Yeah.
I'll gain some of his or not. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for being able to speak. Essentially, it's just an overview, and hopefully it will complement what Manuel has already said. I shan't be going into such detail as Manuel has gone into. With the title, the Recession and Cutting State Subsidies, Limited Market Reforms in Sport and Leisure, and Public Critique. So what I'll look at is the commercialisation that's been mentioned already. And when I talk about public critique, it's not necessarily against commercialisation and commodification, it's more to do with sport in general. So we'll see that sports, and I think you probably understand this anyway, but sport was seen as a metaphor during the perestroika era for all the malaise of the system. It was used to sort of express this discontent. I'll essentially focus on Russia and the five stands, as I call them: Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan and Turkmenistan. But essentially the arguments I'm looking at, they cover the whole of the Soviet Union. I've tended to shy away from using the word Soviet and communist, and I'll explain why later, but I just sometimes think language is rather loaded, and I feel that when we say China is a communist state, well, clearly it's a capitalist communist state. I'm not trying to be clever or to undermine anyone, it's just, and Soviet as well. Obviously we are talking about the Soviet Union, but again, that's a loaded term. So I did sort of alternatively think perhaps we could call it, looking at the extreme left-wing authoritarian states' response to national debt and and the idea really is to make sport self-regulating, particularly at the professional level, which it was officially before perestroika amateur, but as we know, in essence it wasn't, and to make it self-financing. So it's football that was becoming self-financing, and there's quite rightly mentioned it was the most popular sport, but also the Komsomol and that network, that youth organisation, which I'll briefly mention, for 14 to 28-year-olds who were involved in the organisation of sport. The idea was for all their sport facilities, which were very, very extensive, for them to be self-financing as well. So I've only got 9 slides, and very quickly I think Manuel's probably touched upon many of the issues already. The idea with there was this gross national debt. They were making their money from selling oil, which is rather similar. Russia's selling oil today to make its money, its revenues, and the Soviet Union was. Perestroika was the restructuring essentially initially of the economy, but it becomes much more than that, and it produces a dynamic which, because of the nature of the Soviet system, produces this dynamic that went out of control from 1986 to 1991. So it's this kind of idea that you've got this new way of thinking, the commercialization, the sport element comes into it, where you have this to create a dynamic society. You're giving you're allowing groups within society, cooperatives and other groups, business people, who are emerging through this change, this period of change, to sort of have some say in the society, to create a dynamic system. The idea is to try and make it, as we know, democratic, and they termed it democratic socialism. So we're looking at deregulation, self-regulation, and to make the enterprises self-financing. So let's have a look at this commercialization. And I don't want to repeat what has been said already, but as we know, the system operated. Officially, it was an amateur system, but we know that the security services they were financed by the state, and we know that also that the athletes working in the factories would only turn up on payday. So they would sort of be training, and then they would turn up on payday. And there were benefits from winning medals, which I will touch upon as well, various awards and essentially money and gifts from the state. As it's been touched upon already, the most popular sport at the time in Russia and arguably in Central Asia. If we look at Central Asia, when we look at the stands in the sense of there were folk sports which were propagated by the state, the folk tradition of sport, interesting talk in itself, was propagated by the Soviet Union, by Moscow, to create this sort of local national identities. At the same time, there was this like Europeanization of the society in Central Asia. So many of these stadiums and football, for example, was introduced into the region. What's quite significant, and I'm not too sure if you've touched upon it already, but what you've got here really is when you've got talking about the change in the commercialization of the system with perestroika, is this kind of you're challenging the status quo. So if we say you've got the three classes of the intellectual class, we've got the workers and we've got the peasants, put crudely, you're challenging a power structure there. It's not just the perestroika, it's not just an elite top-down imposition by Gorbachev and Yeltsin and those that were sympathetic to that idea. It's also the whole body of the middle classes actually run the system. So we, crudely put, I don't know if this stretches, but if you talk about a squeezed middle today in the UK, well, they would have felt perhaps a squeeze in themselves because they were controlling the ministries of sport, this group of people, this class. And so this kind of, you get this debate, and you've probably come across it yourself in the literature, whereby, for example, from the Football Federation that was to the Football Union that was created between 1987 and 1989, there was a lot of sort of in-house discussion between, there was a lot of these different ideas bubbling forth about how payments were to be made, the names of the new bodies and the groups and who would benefit from, and this kind of tussling over power, and they could sort of realise it was very, very novel. It was very unknown to them, this kind of idea of 70 years of communism. Then all of a sudden it's kind of almost like a mini revolution. All of a sudden you can sort of access money. So it's a very sort of unique situation. It goes across the board, so it isn't just football. It's all sort of those sports, and I'll touch upon some of the Western, the newer sports that were kind of coming through the system in the 70s and 80s. But it goes right across the board, and it goes right into, as I mentioned earlier, about the Komsomol. That's quite important. So, as far as I know, the only people that weren't going to be touched by the commercialisation were the sports schools for the children. But at the professional level, so at the professional football leagues, hockey leagues, and the various sports that were being played, they were going to be. The idea was to create revenue, to be self-funding. Already, you see, the thing about it, there's this kind of grey area in the whole of this discussion, because you're looking at a system really that was never amateur. Before the revolution, it was you had sporting clubs, professionals as such. I'm not too sure if you could call them professionals in the Tsarist period, but there were these various societies and sports clubs that the Soviets all the Bolsheviks sort of took over to some extent and used for their own ideology. But the point I'm trying to make is there's a lot of sort of grey area between different sort of ideas. So when we're talking about the commercialisation and professionalisation, it was already yes, it was a new idea, the accessing money, but this idea that you could of sport. Well, let me rephrase that anyway. We have a lottery today. There was a lottery created in the Soviet Union in the 1970s, so to sort of finance the operation. Independent clubs begin to open in '86, which it's probably been mentioned already, and
87.
87, yeah. And also like gymnasiums and youth clubs and clubs, they started to operate as cooperatives. And they would charge a small fee. Now they probably would have charged a small fee anyway for entry, but the idea was to create more wealth, so the fees start to increase. interesting things start to happen at this time as well, which you kind of try and sort of link into influences from the West. For example, football fan clubs were permitted to exist, and they were quite interesting themselves because the state tried to sort of absorb the energy of the young people. The Komsomol was losing its appeal at this period during the 1990s, late 1980s, and so there were many hundreds of different sort of leisure clubs that were created across the Soviet Union, and I've used the term. I said I wasn't going to use it, and there's the idea was for the state to sort of absorb the energy of these groups. So football clubs were permitted to exist. Football tension, which had existed, you've got sort of football gangs emerging as well. It's quite an interesting sort of subject area in itself for an essay. It's already been mentioned about budget cuts. So the idea is to make it self-funding. All the money was going to the military, of course. Yeah, there was all restructuring, rationalisation of the system. The trade unions were merged, sporting trade unions were merged, and this idea, and we're going back to sort of the philosophy of perestroika, the idea that the new thinking, the idea that you would be responsive to your users. I mean, it's very, very sort of novel in this particular form of authoritarian rule, that you would respond to the needs of the union reps would respond to the needs of the sports the sports people and the general public. Well, if we can use the word public in the Soviet Union. This idea of Western influence is quite interesting, and I'm just playing with this idea about globalization. But these various sports were introduced in the 70s and 80s, which were of a commercial nature. So it's motor racing, baseball, greyhound racing, snooker, golf. And the Komsomol even supported an American football competition in '89. It's quite interesting how these sports come into play, and they would sort of fit in very well if they were accepted by the regime. They would fit in very well to sort of making partners with becoming partners with Western organisations that sort of run these sports. So they kind of becoming popular, and at the same time, they can kind of be a bridge to the West. So it's kind of like a soft power in a sense. Also, what is notable in the 70s and 80s, television comes into play. So this whole idea of the collective society is still in the discussion, but at the same time you're noticing people when they go for holidays, you've got families going for holidays and you'd go with your friends, and these are kind of novel ideas. It isn't just, you still have the pioneer camps, you still have the Komsomol camps, you still have these kind of the Butlins, the Soviet version of Butlins, but at the same time you've got kind of a much more, I wouldn't say individualistic, but people sort of thinking for themselves a little bit more. To repeat the point, I'll skip the football violence if that's okay. And then what I want to do is sort of shift very quickly, is to sort of look at this criticism of sport that existed. I've already said that sport was criticised and was seen, it was used for a metaphor for the illness or the malaise of the Soviet system. And who was criticising it? Well, it was essentially it was the journalists, and the public felt much more sort of confident to speak out during Glasnost 87, 86. Of course, it creates a dynamic where people are talking about many other things, nationalism, their identity, and sport is one sort of vehicle that can be used to sort of to criticise the system. So what are they saying? Well, they're saying they're actually having a go at the very nature, the very coercive nature of the Soviet system and the centralised model. So so if you've got Gorbachev top down criticising or seeking to change the very structure of the society, you've got the underneath that. It's opened up this kind of dynamic where people are saying, yeah, we agree with you, but actually there's a lot more going on we'd like to talk about. And the main paradox that I come across, or the main argument, is that essentially we could say, I don't know, essentially is anything essential, but we could say that if we say that the Soviet Union, I've mentioned it again, was a second world society, then people are asking, why is all the money going into the Olympic champions? Why is it being channeled to them when the common masses or the everyday folk aren't benefiting as much? Okay, right. Okay, so what they're critiquing is the 1930s Stalinist idea of the ready for labour and defence policy, where you had this kind of national network of sports clubs, societies, awards, systems. It was very intensive, and the idea essentially of it was to create this kind of worker, soldier, citizen for both men and women in Russia and in the Soviet and in Central Asia. Already during the 1970s, the figures were of what was actually written as being projected out to the public as what was legitimate, and what was actually what the true figures and statistics were found to be falsified. And there was a documentary produced, I think it was in '89, where these talks and these points were mentioned. But for example, you can see there that in Uzbekistan it was noted in '71 that there were 904 weightlifters, when in fact the Soviets admitted, or the system admitted itself, that there were only 79. There were 100 weightlifters in 4 clubs. They were falsified. Places like Uzbekistan were the centre of cotton production for the Soviet Union. Those figures were arguably falsified, and it became, there was this kind of idea that so much was within that society. So these ideas are being reignited in society and being discussed in the 1980s. And you can see the most prominent, the most important point on that slide is it does say that there was less participation amongst the masses. A third, for example, okay, why would you have a labour and defence policy, and why would you make sport and physical culture so important for the society? Far more so than we've had in this, in Britain. It's one of the ideas is for the conscripts. It was found, I think, during the Boer War in the UK, where the men weren't fit enough to be the soldiers. Well, the same thing happened in the Soviet Union. Up to a third of the conscripts in Central Asia and in Russia were being returned by the sergeants, so saying these guys aren't up to the standard. With the Central Asians, you've got the double whammy. They had to learn Russian as well. So not only some of them weren't physically strong enough, but they couldn't speak Russian up to the standard required for a technological army. It was also found that women weren't as involved as so we've got these images, and we could sit here now and give you a talk and say, oh yeah, we could give you slide after slide and slide of women athletes, and I think I've done it in the past, of Olympic athletes, and how wonderful they look, and how important it is, but at the same time the reality was it was all coming out during Glasnost and Perestroika that the women's participation wasn't that high in some of the sports, and certainly in Central Asia, because the majority of the population lived in the rural district, so they couldn't even access the sports facilities, because the whole idea of this system was that it was an urbanized society. So people migrated, they wanted migration into the cities. Well, people weren't migrating into the cities in Central Asia because the state welfare system was so nice. You would sit back and you'd have your little farm, you'd have your job in the kolkhoz or the svokhoz, in the collective farm, or the state farm in the factory. And then you would go back home to your little home, and you'd have some land, and you'd grow food on there, and you would sell that food on market day. So why move to the city? So the people that move, this is where the Komsomol, plays such an important role, and this is why sport does play such an important role, because the idea was to sort of win at hearts and minds, bring people to the urban centres, and sort of to create this socialist people. We're almost finished now. Very important points. One of the key things that was raised was what they termed child abuse of the young athletes. We know about some awful cases. The Yelena Mokina, she was paralysed training for the Olympics. She was pushed so hard. How old was she? 13, 14, 15, and she was pushed so hard to train these exercises which she wasn't familiar with, that she broke her neck in training for the Moscow Olympics, and subsequently she was paralysed. Those other stories, the certificates were falsified. This all becomes public. Not people kind of suspected it, but they never spoke about it. And perhaps because it was a closed society, so it was very difficult. You've got Radio Liberty and various American organisations beaming in radio stories into these people, and there was clandestine literature being passed around in cassettes and things. It's very difficult sort of to communicate their frustration with the system. So Gorbachev has allowed this to happen, but these are just a few examples of 15-year-olds taking anabolic steroids to beef them up. And the last two slides, again, it's to do with drugs. In '89, a documentary that I mentioned earlier, that they actually admit that there was a drugs problem amongst the sporting professional athletes, and that what they were doing is they were testing the athletes before they went abroad to make sure they were clear, so that they wouldn't show the performance enhancing drugs that they were taking. And of course we had the Ben Johnson case, and you've got the track coach there, Tia Ovanesian.
Ovanesian.
Yeah, because you've got all these different names. I mean, it's incredible when you read this literature. You've got they're not Russian or they've got necessarily. You've
Armenian.
got Tatar, Armenian, Georgians. You've got Turks, Persians. There's Greeks in there. There's it's incredible. The Germans, plenty of Germans.
State of many nations.
Yeah, it's incredible. 100 different nations. And that was an interesting point about perestroika as well. It brings up this idea that throughout the whole of the 60s and 70s, the system had always critiqued, the West for its drugs culture. Well, the citizens themselves were saying, look, it's happening in our own place. The corruption within the system was rife. It goes back quite some time, actually, because people sort of expected some kind of reward, a gift. This notion of a gift. You do something in a system that doesn't really operate by money, then therefore you gift someone a gift, a present. So often it was a car or a phone or a house. But this idea comes up, you see it in the literature, that athletes wouldn't perform unless they were offered a gift. Wanted something. I want a car. I want a telephone. And I'm not saying this was, across everybody, but it was. There are significant stories to show that there was kind of what the official picture was and what the reality was, which were obviously two different things. And this idea of sports heroes is very important within any society, but in the Soviet society even more so. And you've got these notions of people going off in Sputnik and all these national heroes that they have. Sports heroes, very important in the Olympics. They couldn't compete in many other spheres of society, regarding technology and sort of the general material wealth of the population. So these national heroes were very important. And then that kind of, once you start questioning your national heroes, then it starts questioning, I think deeper sort of feelings about what the values are of that society. And just the last slide, there was a notable change for women, and forgive me for merging these two slides, these two sections together. The various sports that were forbidden for women were allowed: bodybuilding, boxing, long distance running, water polo, ice hockey, judo, weightlifting. It was quite a masculine society, really, this what we're looking at, and both Russia and Central Asia. And this notion that women were to, at one level, when required during war, they can go and be soldiers or help in the war effort, certainly work in factories to sort of build the armaments, but not strong enough to do these sports or participate in them until perestroika. And the other most sort of disturbing issue was this disabled athletes. They weren't. It's not obviously it's not a case of demeaning these people, but this society was supposed to be perfect, and they didn't fit the model. So it was only until perestroika that they were being trained, and except the first team went off to the Seoul Paralympics. So I'll finish there. I'm sorry if I'm a bit rusty in that, but I hope I've thrown a few ideas out anyway. And if you want to ask anything about Central Asia in particular, I'll do my best. Thank you.
Can I just say something really quick? I think especially with women's sports, it's very important to highlight that a lot of these sports, football is one example, was allowed very late in Western Europe as well. You know, this idea to bring in re-bring in the World Cup, for example. So the Soviet Union was late, but they weren't the last. And hockey, I think, ice hockey in general was very late across the board for women's sports. I think so.
Okay. Well, we'll thank Sevket.